While rehearsing one night for the upcoming Christmas cantata, our community choir sang these words. So comfort, comfort my people, says the Lord God who reigns on high. To Jerusalem say your night is gone, for the Lord has heard your cry. I started to tear up at these words, for it was only a week or so after the Hamas attack on Israel and the subsequent retaliation on Gaza, all of which is still weighing heavily on our hearts. How I wish that I could speak words of comfort to the people of Israel and of Palestine, to all the people in all the places. But how does one comfort people in a time of war? The words we were singing are not new. They were written centuries ago, long before the advent of Christ or Christmas carols. Those words were written by a prophet we know as Isaiah, writing words of comfort to a broken-hearted people who had endured decades of exile and persecution. And finally, they would be going back to their beloved homeland, a place known to most of them only through the old stories they had been told. It had been so many years. But at long last, their prayers were answered and they were going back to the place where they belonged. The peace and comfort of going back to their ancestral lands was meaningful, but the prophet's words carried much more than a promise. They also carried a call to a new way of living, a way that would confer blessing upon all people in all times and all places. The prophet Isaiah snapped people to attentive listening, saying, a voice cries out, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people, all flesh, shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. The return of the people to their homeland would in itself mean little if they did not follow the way of God, a way of equality and just distribution of resources, the evening out of imbalanced power structures that didn't glorify God or bring about God's will for the world. According to the prophet, God's glory would only be revealed when all flesh, all living things, would see it together. This just and equitable way of living that had always been God's dream. You see, in the ancient Hebrew language, this is called shalom. We often translate it as peace, but shalom is so much more than the absence of conflict. Shalom is what happens when everyone has access to what they need for wholeness. Shalom is when everyone has enough to eat, a safe place to live, meaningful relationships, and a way of living into their purpose. Until all these needs are met for everyone, everywhere, there will be no true shalom. Centuries after the prophet spoke words of comfort to his people, their descendants found themselves still living in their beloved homeland, but all was not well, and they were not at peace. Not because they were at war, they weren't, but they weren't experiencing shalom. You see, they were living under Roman occupation, meaning they paid more than they could afford to support the Roman Empire and its famous Pax Romana, meaning Roman peace. But Roman peace meant that any uprising was immediately and violently suppressed by Roman soldiers. Forced into submission, people had no way to protest the injustice of their poverty and misery. Things may have seemed peaceful on the outside, but the hearts of the people were deeply troubled. They knew life could be better than it was, but how? Into this time of malaise and unrest, a voice in the wilderness cried out, an echo of Isaiah's words. A man named John called God's people to change their hearts and their minds, to prepare the way of the Lord, which was revealed to them by God's own embodied presence, Jesus. Jesus showed people how to level things out, teaching that abundance is meant to be shared, that no one is blessed until everyone is blessed. It wasn't a radically new idea. It was that ancient idea of shalom, the true path to peace. Jesus had the heart of God, as expressed through Isaiah's metaphor of God as a loving shepherd. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms and carry them in his bosom and gently lead the mother sheep. Jesus led his people gently, gathering them and feeding them, giving them a peace much different than the so-called Roman peace. Just as God never coerces us to do God's will, Jesus never forced anyone to follow him. He just identified and met the needs they had, and they responded in love. Of course, there is much more to Jesus' story, but the essence of why he came to us was to lead his people in the path of peace, to show them what it really looked like to live in such a way that all flesh, all beings could glorify the God who had loved this beautiful place into being. And for those of us who are wondering today how to bring about peace on earth, it starts by understanding Jesus' way, God's way of shalom. Who has needs that are unmet? How can those needs be met? As long as there are unmet needs, there will be no true peace. There's an African proverb that says, children not kept warm by the fires of the village will burn it down. There are real things we can do to foster peace on earth. Jesus told his followers to stay awake and pay attention, meaning not becoming complacent or blind to how things are. We have grown accustomed to living in a world that feels like a mess. But the good news is that God has helped people deal with messes before and still can. It is God's will. It is God's way. And for us, followers of Jesus, it becomes our way. And it starts by recognizing that we are all one with God and one with each other. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, we all have to learn together as brothers, or we will perish together as fools. When we can learn to value and even cherish everyone and everything, recognizing each element of the created order as sacred and worthy of care and concern, we begin to live in a way that promotes peace. We think differently, we speak differently, we act differently, we spend differently, and all of this changes the world, bringing about the peace and shalom that is God's deepest longing. But a changed world has to begin with a changed heart. We can't expect there to be peace on earth unless we learn to embody it, each of us. 6th century Taoist Lao Tzu gave us these enduring words, relevant today. If there is to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the nations. If there is peace in the nations, there must be peace in the cities. If there is to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. If there is to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in the home. And if there is to be peace in the home, there must be peace in the heart. A changed world really does begin with a changed heart. When we find inner peace, we naturally want the same for everyone, for all people, and all things. Which is all good and well, but you know as well as I do that some needs are really, really tricky to meet. When someone is given a dreaded diagnosis or suffers the loss of a loved one or is struggling with addiction, how do you speak comfort into a situation that feels impossible? How do you help someone whose needs are simply overwhelming? A few years ago, a friend of mine was in a terrible accident. She was on foot crossing a rather quiet street, and coming down the road toward her was a brand new pickup truck driven by an elderly man who misjudged the location of the pedals in his new truck, hitting the throttle instead of the brake, and plowing into the pedestrian. She was thrown violently to the ground, knocked unconscious and badly injured. A crowd of passers-by soon gathered, but no one dared to move her body until the first responders could arrive. The risk of doing more harm was too great. But one man sat down on the asphalt beside her, scorching hot asphalt. It was summertime and well over 100 degrees. And gently he cradled her arm, which was the best he could do without moving her. He sat with her until the ambulance arrived, simply holding her arm and telling her softly that she was going to be all right. When she gained consciousness, she was in the hospital, severely injured from the accident and with third-degree burns on every part of her body that had been in contact with the hot asphalt. Only her one arm was unburned, that arm that had been cradled by the stranger. She doesn't recall his face, she doesn't know his name, but the gift he gave her was one of the most precious gifts she has ever received. He could not mend her broken bones. and he couldn't even protect the majority of her skin from being burned. But his non-anxious presence gave her a sense of peace and comfort that she carries with her even now. Maybe you have experienced this gift of presence during a dark time in your life, or maybe you have given the gift of your presence to someone in their time of need. In this time of year, when the days are short and the nights long, when the loudest jingling of bells cannot drown out the cries of an aching planet and a heartbroken people, maybe the best gift any of us can give is the gift of our own non-anxious presence, a willingness to sit with someone and just be. Let us comfort the people we can, using words if we have them and silence when we don't. That's the first step to shalom, the peace that brings healing and wholeness to the world, one heart at a time. And if this sounds too optimistic during a time of war, listen to these words written by Eddie Hillesum, a young Jewish woman whose life ended in 1943 at Auschwitz. In her diary, Eddie wrote, "Ultimately, we have just one moral duty, to reclaim large areas of peace in ourselves, more and more peace, and to reflect it toward others. And the more peace there is in us, the more peace there will be in our troubled world." May God's shalom and the peace of Christ be with you, and may it shine through you and through those touched by your presence, until the world living in darkness can finally be illuminated by the light.